As you may know, one of my teachers and mentors was the late psychiatrist Milton H. Erickson. He was an amazing fellow and quite a storyteller. And one day when I was studying with him in the 70s, he told me this story, and it was like being hit by a billiard ball. My whole life and my whole career took a new direction when I heard this story, and it really showed me the power of stories, of how they can change people. And so this was a story about a guy who'd been one of Erickson's patients, and he was all messed up. He had a really neurotic life, and Erickson, with his creative and unusual therapy, had basically sorted this guy's life out. From his mother being dominant in his life, he just had terrible problems where he had germophobia all the time. He wet his pants at his work. I mean, he was all messed up. Erickson did this really weird and creative stuff and helped him solve his problems. Well, about 6 months later, he called Erickson and he said, you know, you helped me so much. And he said, I've gotten out from the domination of my mother, but I'm still really close to her sister, my aunt. And he said, I know you're going to Milwaukee where she lives, and I'd really love it if you'd get a chance to go visit her. She's become really depressed. She's been in a wheelchair for the last couple of years due to an illness, and she's just withdrawn from the world, and I'm really worried about her. She's talking like she wants to give up, maybe suicide. And I know she's been depressed for a while. I talk to her every week, and I told her all about you and how you'd help me, and she's willing to talk to you. So when you go to Milwaukee, when you're done with your workshop, would you be willing to go over and visit her and see if you could help her? So Erickson agrees to do it. And he travels to Milwaukee and he gives his workshop. After the workshop, he goes and visits the woman's house. And she tells him her story, and he can see part of the story. Well, he rings the doorbell, and this is in the 1950s. Erickson had had polio early in his life, so he walked with cane or canes, and she was in a wheelchair. Immediately, when she opens the door, she's heard about this Milton Erickson, but she didn't know he'd had a handicap of any kind. So they instantly bond, because in the 50s, if you were handicapped, you were different from everybody else. So he knows what she's dealing with. She has inherited a lot of money from her family, a very wealthy family, and she lives in this big family house that she's inherited with like 12 rooms. She lives alone. She's never married, never had kids. And she has enough money that when she got in a wheelchair, she had the house converted to wheelchair accessibility. So there's ramps all over the house. She's even, because it's a 3-story house, she's even put in an elevator, a lift. And so she can get up to the top floors. And so she's showing Erickson around, and while she's showing him around, she tells him the story of her life. She used to be really active in her community because she inherited a lot of money. She didn't really have to work. She never got married. And she was very active in her church community and in social good in the community. But now in the last couple of years, it's really hard for her to get around. The world isn't wheelchair accessible. She has a guy who will, drive her around and who does some handiwork for her and some gardening for her. But she doesn't really like to use them because it's a real hassle to get the wheelchair in the car, and she doesn't go to church anymore because it's a real hassle. She barely goes, and she's embarrassed about being in the chair, and she has to wait until services have started in the church and let him lift her up to put her in the back of the church, and she leaves before the services have ended because she doesn't want to see anybody because she's embarrassed about the whole thing. And they treat her differently now that she's in the wheelchair. So Erickson hears all about this as she's giving a tour around the house. Finally, she gets to the end of the tour. It's her pride and joy, the greenhouse, the plant nursery that's attached to the house. And Erickson grew up on a farm, so he shows a great deal of interest in the plants that she's growing. And he notices on the potting shelf in the greenhouse, there are a bunch of plants up there with really small little leaves coming off. And he asks about them, and she points to one plant that's in the greenhouse, and she said, they're all from that one plant. It's an African violet plant, and I've taken cuttings off, and I've gotten all these new plants going. And that's really hard, and Erickson admires this. This is very hard to make the cuttings and make sure that they start to grow. And so he turns to her and he says, your nephew's worried about you. And she said, yes, I know. He thinks you're depressed, Erickson says. And she says, yes, I have been rather depressed the last few years since my illness. And he says, I don't think that's the problem. She brightens up and says, you don't? He says, no, I think the problem is you haven't been a very good Christian. Well, she came from a really moralizing family, and she's a little offended by this, defensive right away. But once he explains, she calms down a little. He says, no, you have all this money, all this time on your hands. You have this amazing talent with plants. What I recommend is you get your church bulletin, your church newsletter, and your church membership list. And any time in that church newsletter you see an announcement of a birth, a death, a graduation, an engagement, a marriage, an illness, some happy or sad event in someone in the congregation's life, you get one of these African violet plants that you've made, the new ones that you made, repot it into a gift pot, get this guy to come over and drive you to their home with your Christian and human presence, with congratulations or condolences, whatever's appropriate. And so once he explains this to her, she agrees. Maybe she's been kind of caught up in herself the last few years and hasn't really done the kind of charitable work she'd like to do, and she agrees to give it a try. Well, that was in the 1950s. I studied with Milton Erickson in the 1970s, and I was there with 2 other students when he told that story, and he said, he told me to go to his bookshelf, pull out one of his scrapbooks, and he instructed me to page to a certain page. And there was an article that was cut out from the Milwaukee paper from 1968 or something. And the headline was, African Violet Queen in Milwaukee dies, mourned by thousands. They couldn't fit the people in the church that wanted to come to a memorial service because she touched so many people in the last years of her life, always being the one that showed up with the African Violet Queen, the African Violet plant, and with her congratulations or condolences and her Christian and human presence. And that story made such an impression on me. When the other students left, I couldn't afford to pay Dr. Erickson for his teaching, so I was out in the garden with him because he asked me to do gardening as part of our bartering agreement. And I was pretty intimidated by Erickson, but I turned to him and I said, Dr. Erickson, I was so touched by that story of the African Violet Queen. I want to work that way, but I'm in graduate school and they're teaching me if somebody's depressed, I should get them on medications. I should do background, find out what the history of depression in their family is so I can normalize it and help them understand where it comes from. I should help them change their distorted thinking so they won't be so depressed. How do I get from those ways that I'm learning to this African Violet way of working? That's how I want to work with people. And Erickson, who was in a wheelchair by then in the 70s, looked down at the ground for a little while, and then he looked up and he said, I looked all around her life. Everything looked depressing. She lived in this big house all alone. She kept the curtains drawn because he was embarrassed about being in a wheelchair. It was dark. It was lonely. The only sign of life I could see in her and in her life were those African violets. He said, I thought it'd be easier to grow the African violet parts of her life than to weed out the depression. Then he sent me back to work in the garden. And that moment really stuck with me because I went on a quest. How do I find the African violet parts of people's lives to help them change and find new possibilities?